Do you think the jihad needs you? I know that the jihad doesn't need me, but I need it.
Are you thinking we should do that with the help of violence? Are you convinced at this point?
Never hate so intensely and never love so intensely. Volunteers who came from all over the world were about 900. We buried 350 there.
It was a very peaceful religion. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Islam is not a religion of peace. And Islam, basically, by the way, is one of the most capitalistic, free market religions you could ever find. The embassy was actually a front for the CIA.
So, a lot of people have lived interesting lives, but some tells me today's guest has lived maybe a little bit more of an interesting life. You'll find out here in a second when I tell you. This man went from being part of Al-Qaeda, yes, Al-Qaeda in 1996. He met Osama bin Laden for the first time. You'll kind of hear how that process takes place. And in December 98, he leaves and he goes from Al-Qaeda to joining MI6. And he writes a book. The title of the book is 9 Lives, My Time as MI6 Top Spy Inside Al-Qaeda. With that being said, Aimen Dean, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Thank you for having me.
So you've lived a quite, interesting life there. That qualifies for interesting.
Sure hope so.
Yeah. So can you take us back and kind of tell me about your upbringing, where you grew up at, so the audience knows? Obviously, I got all the notes here in front of me, but if you don't mind taking a moment and sharing with that, and then how you got recruited into Al-Qaeda, I think that'd be a good way to start.
Well, I can say that I was more of the typical Middle Eastern salad, if you could say it that way, because I was a Bahraini national, born in Saudi Arabia, to a father who was born in Iraq, and his mother was half Turkish, half Greek Jewish, and my mother was from Lebanon. So I ended up basically being a true Middle Eastern, mix, to the point where I remember when I looked at my DNA many years later, I found that 40% from the Middle East, 30% from Persia, 10% from Turkey and the Caucasus, and about 10-12% from the Indian subcontinent, including Afghanistan. So I thought, wow, what a mix. But nonetheless, if you grow up in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, and you will be growing up in a society that was deeply conservative Sunni Muslim, and where I lived actually was a mix of Shia and Sunnis, because I lived in the eastern part of the country. So, and I lived in the most divisive era you could ever imagine. Imagine that my mother was from Lebanon, so she was worried about the Lebanese civil war that was taking place in her mother country. At the same time, just a few hundred kilometers away to the north, Iraq was locked in a deadly war with Iran for 8 years, from 1980 until 1988. So in our school, I remember—
I was living in Iran at that time when that was going on in Tehran, 80 to 88. It was not pretty, it was ugly.
Exactly. So I remember where I grew up in our school, one third of the students were Shia and 2/3 were Sunnis. So it was almost like supporting two opposing football teams. So the Sunnis will support Saddam Hussein and Iraq, and the Shia will be supporting Iran and Ayatollah Khomeini. So, and of course, for us kids, it was very strange. I mean, how would you desensitize war to the point where basically, you view it as a contest, between two teams, and you make it so sectarian, that, we are all Saudis or Gulf people there, and yet we were supporting different sides of the war according to our sectarian preferences. So if that doesn't politicize a young child at such young age, I don't know what would do, actually. And then, ironically, the man who we supported, the man who we were cheering up for, Saddam Hussein, in August of 1990, decided to stab us in the back, or actually the front, moved into Kuwait. And as a result, my city, Khobar, was the first major city from the Kuwaiti border. So 3 hours drive from the Kuwaiti border, we started to see what I would call in 1990 the richest caravan of refugees you could ever imagine. Imagine refugees coming in BMWs, Mercedes, Cadillacs. It was a weird sight to see. People who wore same Arabic dresses as us, they spoke the same accent, almost the same tribal makeup, and yet they were running away from the person who, until 2 months ago, we were cheering up, calling him the, the hero of the Arab world, the guardian of the Eastern Gate, as the Arabs used to call him. And he basically stabbed us, basically in front and back, and that, of course, resulted in a massive international effort to expel him. How that happened? Well, from seeing rich refugees coming into my city, I started seeing many American soldiers landing in my city, because my city also was the host of the largest military air base in the entire Middle East, King Abdulaziz Air Base. So, I mean, I was seeing, hundreds of US Humvees and, armored vehicles just going around. These American soldiers were very approachable, very friendly. They were.
What year is this? What year?
1990.
Got it. Okay.
Of course, they were at that year. They were friendly. They were not yet. They haven't yet faced the, the hostility that grew up with the Qaeda, basically, of the later 1990s. And so they were even lining up in the fast food chains in order to order burgers and fries and all of that. And they were just happy to mingle with the local population, because for us, we saw them as the protectors from a impending Iraqi invasion that Saddam Hussein wanted to control the oil wells and the oil wealth of the Gulf, and therefore we were afraid we would be next after Kuwait. The presence of the American soldiers and the American forces was a reassuring presence. But at the same time, I was a religious kid. My religious leaders at that time were opposing completely the presence of the American troops. They were saying that it is completely against the spirit of Islam that in the Arabian Peninsula, an army of 500,000 Christian soldiers are present. This is not what was supposed to happen, and therefore they are supposed to be expelled rather than being invited. Now, this is where the first took place, in my mindset. I was by that time 11, going on 12, and I was already heavily politicized kid because of everything that was happening around me.
Let me ask you, at that time, when you're 11 years old, about to be 12, in your mind, who's America, who's Iran, who's Israel, in your mind?
For us, Iran was the sectarian threat. Israel was the occupier of the holy sites. America was the big bully, kid on the block, but with cool gadgets. That's how we viewed America at the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So
please continue.
Yeah.
You're 11 years old, about to be 12 years old.
Exactly. So for me, I started to become more confused about what to believe anymore. I mean, should I cheer the American presence and the fact that they will be not only defending us against a potential invasion by Saddam Hussein, but also expel Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait? Because for us, still, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was unjust, and he is not supposed to have invaded Kuwait, and therefore he needs to be expelled. And that is, I think, where at that time I was reading a leaflet I saw in one of the mosques. That leaflet was saying that it was a big historical mistake on with catastrophic proportions that we have allowed the Americans to come in. The solution was to raise an army of jihadists, an army of mujahideen, to push back Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Who signed that pamphlet, which I saw in that mosque? Osama bin Laden. And that was the first time I heard, and I read the name Osama bin Laden, that he is one of the leaders of the Arab jihadists in Afghanistan, fighting against the Soviets and then later the communist regime in Kabul. And he was opposed to the presence of American forces. And he was talking about the fact that you can't have an American Christian army present in the holy, sanctified land of Arabia. Although I was wondering, there is nothing holy about my city. I mean, yes, there is Mecca, Medina, that's holy, but the rest of it is not. However, you know, for Osama bin Laden and for many of those who were like-minded, including the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia, the other hybrid group, you know, which is the hybrid Salafists, Wahhabists, and Muslim Brotherhood groups, they were not exactly happy with the presence of the American forces. They believed basically that the solution should come from within, you know, the so-called Muslim Ummah or the Muslim nation. However, I was thinking at the time, how could the solution come from within the Muslim Ummah when many parts of the so-called Muslim nation were actually supporting Saddam Hussein, including Yasser Arafat, for God's sake, as well as you know, the leaders of Yemen and Sudan. That is, I think, where you know, my mind was spinning around faster than you know I could actually comprehend in terms of who to believe and what to follow. Nonetheless, the Gulf War took place in January of 1991. And for us, it was the first televised war. And this is the first time ever in my life I saw CNN. So at the time, CNN was the network station that broadcasted the war live for everyone to see, whether from Baghdad or from, you know, even our own city, which was, due to the presence of the air base, subject to Scud missile attack by the Iraqi forces. And of course, basically, it's the first time we were subject to air raid sirens. We have to put the gas masks on ourselves because we were suspecting that we will be attacked by chemical weapons, that the missiles are carrying chemical warheads. We were, of course, living through a nightmare. And that is, I think, where my first experience of war, it was not as brutal as those who experienced it, of course, in Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. But nonetheless, it was the first time I felt what it feels like to be subject of an attack by such sophisticated weaponry, but also glad for the American air defense network, the Patriot system, which shot down the vast majority of those missiles before they reached the ground. Although near the end, I remember I was at the roof of my house when I saw one of the missiles, you know, basically landing just only 800 meters from my house, and it hit a barracks, you know, a building where 28 American soldiers were killed due to that attack. So I remember I saw all the ambulances going, and I saw dozens of them, the firefighters, and heard the news, and somehow it made me sad, you know, the death of the soldiers. And that was, I think, the last time the death of American soldiers made me sad for many years to come, because at later life, I became so radical in my thoughts that I would end up celebrating the death of American soldiers rather than the other way around.
How did that indoctrination take place? What were events that got you to believe in the fact that you should celebrate rather than mourn over the loss of American lives? What happened there? How did you get recruited? Who changed your way of thinking?
Two events in particular, I would say. The first event was personal. At the age of 12, just months after the end of the Gulf War, my mother passed away. She was only 49 at that time. It was a brain aneurysm. It was sudden, just as brain aneurysm is, you know, it goes undetected. And that's it. She collapsed. 2 days later, she died. And for me, of course, as a young religious kid at that time, for me, it was all about finding answers. I was the youngest of my brothers, you know, so it helped that there were older brothers in the house who would, you know, more or less offer some comfort and support. My dad already was dead when I was 4. So basically, like, you know, for me, the passing of my mother was, you know, the loss of the last, I would say, moral compass that stabilizing factor, that anchor that like actually
Yeah.
keeps you safe and secure and grounded. Unfortunately, that was gone. And for me, I drifted into, for example, kids, when they have some freedom, usually like in the basically, they will use that freedom towards, going out with their, with their friends, hanging out, smoking, doing something like, basically bad, whatever. For me, I was more of a nerdish, kid, more into books. And so the drifting was more subtle, more political and ideological and religious. And I ended up basically looking into ways to find solace and, how can I say, consoling basically in religious texts. And one of my teachers at the time said to me that there is a book that if you read, it could help you deal with your grief. And I said to him, what is that? He said, there is a book written by an Egyptian ideologue and a thinker. His name is Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, of course, basically had a great impact, not only on my country, but yours also, basically in Iran, because, he actually, his writings were translated by the current Ayatollah Ali Khamenei when he was in prison, and it provided the framework of political Islam to take shape in Iran and then later in other Islamic movements across the Arab and Muslim world. And so for me, I was told that I should read his books. What is the book I was supposed to read? A book called In the Shades of the Quran. It is 4,000 pages, written over 9 years period. And all of these 9 years, this book was written between the years of 1954 and 1963, when Sayyid Qutb was in jail in Egypt. And the Egyptian jails in the 1950s and 60s were not exactly a picnic. I mean, it was a horror show, to say the least. So he wrote his interpretation, his literary interpretation of the Quran from the prism of pain, grief, and torture, and darkness, and loneliness, and grief. So his commentary on the Quran was, while beautiful in its words and imagery and literary value, it was really all geared towards one aim and one goal, as he always keep repeating this. It is to establish the kingdom of God on earth as he ordained it to be. So this concept of God's kingdom on earth, and that it needs to be achieved through violence, if necessary, which is jihad, in order to achieve a pure Islamic society that would drive away most of the grief and the pain and the suffering that we are experiencing because of the disillusionment and the ill governance that is taking place in the Arab and Muslim world at the time. Remember, he was a socialist at early stages of his life. He dabbled in communism. Then later he became an Islamist, opposing both capitalism and socialism and communism. So basically he arrived at the conclusion that only Islamism could offer a salvation, a solution to the Muslim masses that are yearning for justice. That is Sayyid Qutb. So I ended up between the ages of 12 to the age of 14 reading the writings of Sayyid Qutb and basically being influenced so heavily by it.
How do you spell his name?
Sayyid, which is S-A-Y-Y-E-D, and then Qutb, which is Q-U-T-B.
And this book he wrote, you said 4,000 pages. He wrote in 8-9 years of being in jail in Egypt in the 50s to 60s. And you said prior to that, he was a communist, and a communist to socialist to
Islamist.
Okay. So in that process, who would you compare him to? Was he like the Karl Marx minus the jail? Was he like the figurehead of sharing some of those philosophies with the people? Who would you compare him to?
I think, in my opinion, he was a revolutionary thinker who basically, for the first time ever, like Karl Marx and others, basically, who advocated the violence of the overthrow of the bourgeoisie governments by the oppressed proletariats, he advocated the violent revolution by the masses to throw away the unjust, un-Islamic rule across the Muslim world and replacing it with Islamic Sharia-based rule. What he called it, the kingdom of God on earth, a semi-utopian society, that is subject to God's laws, but are governed by men of God. That's how he saw the evolution of societies in the Muslim and Arab world into a unified super Islamic structure, which is the caliphate, the kingdom of God on earth. And he was the first one who advocated that since violence or the deployment of violence throughout Islamic history was the prerogative of the state, never the individual, he is the first one to actually advocate the deployment of violence by individuals to overthrow the state and to replace it with a Islamic state.
Wow. So here's what it says here about him. It says, even though most of his observations and criticism were leveled at the Muslim world, Qutb is also known for his intense disapproval of the society and culture of the United States, which he saw as materialistic and obsessed with violence and sexual pleasures. He advocated violence, offensive jihad. Qutb has also been described by his followers as a great thinker and martyr of Islam, while many Western observers and some Muslims see him as key originator of Islamist ideology and an inspiration for violent Islamic groups such as Al-Qaeda. Today, his supporters are identified by his opponents as Qutbists, or Qutbi is what they describe him. So let me ask you, when you read this as a kid, at that point, was he already, did he already have a lot of influence? He's written 30 books, he's been around the block. Was he already an influential figure or not yet when you first read it?
He was an influential figure, no question, because you see, President Nasser of Egypt executed him in 1966. So what he said before he died, which is a very famous quote by him, he said, "Our words remain dead candles with no life until we die for these words, and then they are lit and they are alive." And therefore, basically, he believed that by dying, he will seal his legend. That's why, when he was, about to be hanged, they brought a cleric, to remind him, to say the words, basically before he dies, which is, La ilaha illallah, like, there is no God but God. So he said, to the cleric, "I die this word while you eat bread with that word." So the man knew what he was doing. He was sealing his legend to make sure that his revolutionary ideas will become even more intense and more credible because he died for them.
He knew what he was doing, strategic. And by the way, he was hung because he was conspired to assassinate the president. So, well, that was one of the concerns about it. But let me ask you, when you read the book, at this time when you first read it, you're how old? 12 years old, 13 years old?
Yeah, between the ages of 12 and 14.
So when you read this book the first time, 4,000 pages, what are you thinking when you're done reading it? Are you thinking this guy makes sense? I want to go bring the kingdom of God on earth. Are you thinking we should do that with the help of violence? Are you convinced at this point?
By that time, yes. Because it wasn't just the book, but also the background of the society I was living in. Already there was the post-Iraq war and the agitation by the followers of the Sayyid Qutb, the clerics I used to listen to, just like Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, when he was using the cassette, as the medium through which he was able to communicate with the masses, the first
very effective,
exactly, the first social media
platform. That's right.
To make sure that people who are taking taxis would listen to his sermons. It's the same thing. The cassette was the medium through these clerics were disseminating their revolutionary ideas about the fact that Saudi Arabia for them was not Muslim enough. Can you believe it? Like, I mean, for them, Saudi Arabia, which was a Wahhabist, Salafist, closed Muslim conservative society, was not good enough even. And therefore, there was the need to overthrow them, just like the Shah was overthrown. And therefore, we need to do it. I was so convinced at the time because on one hand, I was reading this book and getting all of these ideas. And on the second hand, I was also listening to these clerics on the, from their cassettes, listening to their lectures and sermons, talking about the need for Islamic solidarity, Islamic awakening, Islamic renaissance, and the need to go from the repetitive, the boring, and this lack of dynamism, as they called it, into a more dynamic, Muslim society that can actually challenge the powers of the world at that time. However, that wasn't the only reason why my radicalization, happened. There was another event, that also led me towards, the jihad and the path of the jihad, which was the Bosnian conflict, which was, raging in 1992. At the time, I was 14. So it just started. And at that time, the, my local mosque, the local charity that I used to belong to, started to collect funds to help the Muslims of Bosnia, who were, of course, subject to the civil wars and the horrors of the civil wars that were taking place in the former Yugoslav republics. Bosnia, was a country where the Muslims made up about half of the population. The other half was divided between Serbs and Croats. They voted for independence from Yugoslavia. That led to the Serbs of the country declaring war on the Muslim majority, and as a result, ethnic cleansing started to take place. Now, these events were portrayed, unfortunately and wrongly, in the Saudi media and the Arab world, intellectual discourse as a war between Christianity and Islam, because the Serbs invoked Christian symbology, while in fact they were fighting a ethnic nationalistic war that had nothing to do basically with Christianity. They were actually killing, their, fellow Christians who were Croats. Of course, basically it was sectarian based because the Serbs were Orthodox and, the Croats were Catholics. But nonetheless, even the Croats were subject to ethnic cleansing, and they were not Muslims, basically they were Christians. But it was portrayed this way in our media and our religious discourse in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab and Muslim world. So suddenly we are not only collecting funds to help, the Muslims there withstand the onslaught of the Serbs. Suddenly we started to see people from our community, including a teacher of mine at school who was a math teacher from a affluent family, would travel there with a member of the Bahraini royal family. Both of them would die there over the summer of 1992 and fighting alongside the Bosnians against the Serbs. And suddenly, we started to hear that, few words put together in one sentence: jihad, martyrdom, and sacrifice, all in one word. And suddenly the Bosnian conflict, which was raging, 3,000 miles away, where, was in fact present in our own classroom, because our teacher is missing. Our math teacher is missing, but he was killed in action in Bosnia. He's a Saudi, from the Saudi deserts, has nothing to do with the lush European mountains of the Balkans. But that Islamic solidarity and that sense of Islamic duty towards oppressed Muslim minority more or less ignited that need in him to go and fight the jihad. So I was asking myself, if my teacher can do it, why can't I? And 2 years later, when I became 16, the catalyst for that event happened when one of my friends, even though he was 3 years my senior, he was actually going to join the jihad in Bosnia. I learned from his brother that he was leaving. So when I was going to his home, to say goodbye, I ended up knocking on his door. And instead of saying goodbye, I was saying, I want to come with you. And I remember, like, I mean, he was, even though he was 19, he himself was young, but he was telling me, since I'm 16, I just became 16 4 days ago. Since you're 16, you can't go. Like, I mean, jihad is not a picnic. He was telling me, Aimen, for God's sake, you are only 16. Do you know what jihad is? People will not just only die, they could actually get wounded, bullet holes, amputations. You could step on a mine and lose your leg. It's not a picnic. Do you think the jihad needs you? I remember that my answer changed his mind and changed my own life. I said to him, Khalid, I know that the jihad doesn't need me, but I need it. I want to go. I need it for my own betterment. I don't want to be a spectator on the, on the seats, basically watching the caravan of history passing me by, wishing that I, made my own, writings on the pages of history. No, I wanted to be part of it. I don't want to be a spectator anymore. That's it. And that changed his mind, and he decided to take me with him. And 2 weeks later, we were in Vienna, on our way to Bosnia.
During your time as a, when you went to Bosnia, and as well as once you joined Al-Qaeda, what are some things you witnessed yourself?
Well, where to start? Like, I mean, I think the right question is, what didn't I witness? In the sense, like, I mean, you see everything once you are in a war, a brutal war like Bosnia. I mean, you see mass graves, you see the charred remains of villages, you see destroyed mosques, destroyed churches, you see, prisoner exchanges where instead of seeing prisoners, who are wearing military uniforms and, big, hairy men, instead you see children being exchanged, basically, like, I mean, who were, in the camps, being held prisoners. You see young 14-year-olds who were held for 2 years as captives, and you hear the horror stories, basically, of them being gang raped. You see a lot of this because of the hatred, the deep hatred that was beneath the surface between the communities there. And this is a warning to many people across the world, is never hate so intensely and never love so intensely. You never know who will be your enemies one day and who will be your friends one day. Moderation in everything, basically, is the key towards longevity of any society. So this is exactly what I've seen. And of course, basically, when we went to Bosnia, we were 4. We left Bosnia, we were 2, because we buried 2 of our, friends back. I mean, the number of the volunteers who came from all over the world were about 900. We buried 350 there.
Wow.
So basically, like, I mean, the life expectancy was really short for anyone who was there. I was wounded in action there, basically, although it was a mild one. I, basically have seen for my eyes, like, as a 16-year-old, things that, well, a 16-year-old shouldn't have witnessed. Like, but then what made me resilient is that I've seen the 13 and the 14 and the 11 and the 9-year-olds, basically, who've seen the horrors of war being more resilient. And that basically gave me hope, basically, that if they can put up with it, if they can go through it, then I can.
Aimen, let me ask you, first time you met Osama bin Laden, how old were you?
Well, it was just before my 18th birthday. It was August, the first week of August of 1996. So I was about to become 18 in about maybe, like, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. By that time I was in Afghanistan. The whole scene shifted now. Bosnia was over, the war was over there, and on the advice in Bosnia, where I met him, on the advice of the mastermind of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, when he came to visit us in Bosnia, his advice was, go to Afghanistan, get training, prepare for the next phase of the war. The camps are reopening. So I followed his advice after a brief detour to the Caucasus, and I ended up in Afghanistan in '96. 2 months after my arrival, or 3 months, I would think, Osama bin Laden returned from Sudan, where he was in exile there, to Afghanistan. And, where we were training, in our training camp, his location was only 45 minutes drive away. So we heard that he was asking around if there are any people from the Arabian Peninsula. He never wanted to say Saudi Arabia, because he always believed that the House of Saud was illegitimate. So he was saying the Arabian Peninsula. So, 14 of us decided to go and see him. And when we went to see him, he was a guest at the compound belonged to one of the warlords of Afghanistan. His name was Yunus Khalis. And I remember when we entered the compound, we saw so many people who were Egyptians and some people from Sudan, Libya, Algeria, as well as himself, originally from Saudi Arabia. But what we saw wasn't impressive. They looked like refugees.
Wasn't, or it was? It wasn't impressive?
Wasn't at all.
Okay.
You see, the problem is many people, when they ask me the question, how was it, their first time, seeing Osama bin Laden, and people expect me to say, oh, wow, it was so impressive. No, it wasn't. And the reason is because everyone in the world, their impression of Osama bin Laden is that neat white turban with the white, clean, well-ironed robes, looking so, clean and tidy. No, that wasn't how I saw Osama bin Laden the first time. He wore very creased robes and an Arabic headscarf over his head that was not at all seeing an iron for weeks, actually. And he looked really disheveled and as if basically he was just lucky to escape with his life. So, the first impression wasn't the best impression, to be honest. But nonetheless, when we sat in front of him, all 14 of us, and of course, he had his lieutenants around him, including Abu Hafs al-Masri, who was his deputy. We sat in front of him to understand why he returned back from Sudan. Of course, he was betrayed by the Sudanese leadership and expelled. But nonetheless, he spoke about the divine mission that he is, embarking on, the divine path laid in front of him. Because he was believing that it was destiny, it was fate that brought him from Sudan all the way back to Afghanistan to enact God's plans in the old ancient prophecies of Islam regarding the armies of the black banners, and the victorious vanguard sweeping from Afghanistan all the way to Jerusalem, all the way to the Arabian Peninsula, paving the way for, the fictional Imam Mahdi, which is the Messiah figure in Islamic imagination, in order, to fill the world with justice after it was filled with injustice. Now, he saw, but by the way, Osama bin Laden was great at reading minds. He would basically look at your face and will see, whether you are a believer, a skeptical, whether you, are really going along with the flow, or are you not like exactly like, understanding what he's saying. So he looked at our faces and he could tell that some of us were really skeptical. Really, are we the, fulfillment of the prophecies? So he said, you might see us right now as a bunch of refugees. People basically who just arrived, escaping, and lucky to be escaped with our lives. It was a miracle actually that we made it without being caught, here in Afghanistan. But he said, remember that when the Prophet Muhammad, he escaped Medina, he escaped Mecca on the night of his migration and a flight to Medina. While he was escaping, the Arab tribes were hunting him, and the Arab knights were, hunting him because basically they wanted to win the bounty on his head. One of the Arab knights, when he finally approached him, his horse fell, broke his legs, and he was tumbling on the ground. So he thought that Muhammad used one of his magic tricks. So he said, to the Prophet, I can't let you just go to Medina. I have to, bring you back. And so the Prophet said, well, if you let us go, then I promise you something. I promise you that you will be wearing the crown and the bracelets of the Persian emperor. So, that Arab knight said, what are you, out of your mind? Like, you are a fugitive in the desert, of the Arabian desert, like, basically, and you are threatening the might of Persia. So he said, yes, I promise you that you will be wearing the crown and the bracelets of the Persian emperor. He said, put it in writing. So the Prophet instructed his companion to, write it for him, give him the parchment sealed with his seal, and that's it. So 16 years later, that Arab knight was actually wearing, the crown and the bracelets of the Persian emperor after the conquest of Ctesiphon, and I think in the year 636 AD or 637 AD. So Osama bin Laden used that incident to say, never ever underestimate what we can do here. We can change history if we believe in ourselves the same way that the Prophet did. Ironically, he did change history when his operatives slammed those airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the US. So this is the mindset of Osama bin Laden, the combative, fanatical, believing mindset of Osama bin Laden just days after he arrived into Afghanistan from Sudan. Next to me, his knee touching my knee, was a man called Abu Ubaida al-Makki. Abu Ubaida, a young Saudi, bespectacled with thick glasses, 2 years exactly, on the 4th of August of 1998, 2 years after that, he was so mesmerized, of course, by Osama bin Laden's talk, he went on to drive the van to the American embassy in Nairobi. So, and that, of course, exploded with, a considerable number of casualties. 220 plus people were killed, including 12 Americans, and as well as 5,000 people wounded. 150 of them were blinded for life. This is the effect of fanatical, eschatological, prophetic words that Osama bin Laden, basically delivered into our minds, basically, and they had the effect of toxins. They were toxic.
That's the guy that was sitting right next to you that drove the van into the American embassy in Nairobi.
Exactly.
He's sitting right next to you. Let me ask you a question. From your research on him and knowing him, now over the years you've had access to a lot of different information yourself, and you've done your own research. You've been around it. What things did Osama bin Laden admire? Was he also a guy who admired Said? Because I just looked up an article while you were speaking, how Khomeini read the book that Said wrote 3 years after he was assassinated. And in 1984, even in Iran, he sent some postcards showing the frowning face of Said behind prison bars before his execution. He issued a postcard, Khomeini did in 84. So that was his inspiration, right? Who was bin Laden's inspiration, a guy that he looked up to outside of Prophet Muhammad and the Quran? Who else was it?
Well, of course, it was Sayyid Qutb. No question about it. For him, Sayyid Qutb was the inspiration because he is the first to call for an Islamic revolution by the masses. It never happened before in Islamic history. Throughout Islamic history, and just to let you know, for example, Muhammad was in fact the last cleric, if we can, use this word to describe him, to be the ruler of a society, because his successors after that were never from the clergy or the class of the clergy. Abu Bakr was a merchant, the first caliph. Umar was a merchant. Uthman was a super merchant, actually, and Ali was a judge and a warrior. And if you look at all those who followed the dynastic empires like the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Ottomans, they were all dynastic rulers, without any clerical or, let's say, basically religious upbringing themselves. So therefore, the idea that Islam, or Islamic societies should be ruled by those who basically are clerics or members of the clergy is an anathema to the Islamic spirit itself. And this is why, the Sayyid Qutb is the first to break away from that, to break away from the idea that the Islamic or the Muslim masses should obey their secular rulers, that the Muslim masses have no right to deploy violence against the state, that only the state has the right to deploy violence and the protection of the state from enemies within the society and from outside. So he broke away completely. Like, I mean, he thrown out all of these, conventions, outside of the window altogether, and decided to come up with an ideology that is similar to communism. In other words, basically, he appropriated Islam in a communistic fashion, because he was actually a communist before, to revolutionize it in a way that enables the masses, the individuals, to carry out arms against the state, so in order to replace it and to bring about Islamic sovereignty. You see, if you look at Shia Islam, jihad is almost absent there, because jihad is only the prerogative of the imam, and since the imam is absent, therefore the the jihad is absent. For Sunni Islam, there are two kinds of jihad. The defensive jihad, if your society is overwhelmed by an enemy, take up arms and defend yourself. Self-defense, that's understood. However, the offensive jihad, the conquest jihad, which unfortunately many Muslims feel ashamed of and try to brush it under the carpet, and say, oh, it doesn't exist. It exists. I'm sorry to say, but thousands, of books basically, explain the concept, and it exists there. I mean, and there is nothing to be ashamed about conquest. I mean, every empire did it, throughout history, from the Romans, basically, to the Byzantines, to the Chinese, to the Indian empires, and Incas, and Aztec, and British and French Empire. Everyone did conquest. That's fine. But Islam as a religion actually did. Sunni Islam did, in fact, put together a theology of conquest jihad. And however, that conquest jihad is only the prerogative of the head of the state. Only a state can sanction that. Now, Sayyid Qutb came after all these years, after 1350 years of solid theology, to come and say, no, 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 we have a third kind of jihad. It's called jihad al-tamkin, or the jihad of sovereignty. The sovereignty jihad, to restore Islam to sovereignty, to the position where it belongs. So, I mean, just like with suicide bombings, just like with many other aspects of modern jihadism, there is a clear departure from the old agreed upon Islamic principles. This is why, when people say that modern day jihadists, basically are really, having twisted many of the interpretations of Islam, it is true to some extent, actually, because they did actually invent quite new forms of theology just to justify the revolutionary ideas that they are, basically supporting and propagating.
Would you consider yourself a Muslim today?
Yes. At the end of the day, thank God, Islam has more than 70 different schools of thought. I would consider myself a hybrid between a Sufi and Salafi, although some people will say what, but I view Islam basically as a spiritual anchor, a something basically. Yeah. Sorry.
Who's Prophet Muhammad to you? Who's Prophet Muhammad to you?
A teacher.
A teacher. Who's Jesus to you?
A divine prophet.
Got it. Who's Salman Rushdie to you and what he wrote about in his satanic verses?
I would say a very mediocre writer.
A very mediocre writer.
Yeah.
Have you read the book?
Yeah, I read it.
What do you think about it?
Basically, the writing wasn't great, basically, but he based his writing on, basically a story that was happened during the time of the Prophet. Then he took it and took extreme liberty with it in order basically to embellish it with imagery and with intrigue and with how can I say, representation of Arab society at the time. But I didn't, while I didn't find it basically a great book, basically that's why I always used to say that the biggest supporter of Rushdie was always Imam Khomeini, because his fatwa actually sold the books for him.
Yeah, made him a bestseller.
Indeed.
Khomeini made Salman a multimillionaire. But going back to it, so have you seen Bill Maher when he goes and debates Muslim and he goes back and forth and he says 75% of Muslims are good, but 25% are extremists? And I don't know if you've seen that before when they go back and forth on that debate. Are you insinuating or suggesting that the fact that the extremists are a byproduct of post Sayyid and what he wrote? Pre that, it was a very peaceful religion. Is that kind of what you're saying? That things changed dramatically after Sayyid?
Oh, no, definitely not. First of all, Islam is not a peaceful religion. Let's put this to bed. Islam is not a religion of peace. It never was. I just said to you before that there is actually a jihad conquest in Islam, basically, and the justification for conquest within Islam itself. But Islam is not a religion of war either. Basically, it is a very what I would call a mercantile imperial religion. So basically it is it basically viewed the conquest of new lands as an opportunity for taxation and commerce. So for them, they were almost copying the Roman Empire, basically expansion. We need to expand because we need more citizens, so they pay more tax. We need to expand because basically this is our commercial destiny. Don't forget, Islam was founded by a merchant. Prophet Muhammad, in fact, he started his life as a merchant, and Islam, basically, by the way, is one of the most capitalistic, free market religions you could ever find. The prohibition of taxation, but the opening of free trade. That putting tariffs and trade barriers is anti-Islamic. So basically, it is one of those religions that actually one of the mottos of one of Muhammad's disciples when he arrived to Medina, poor and destitute, when he was offered charity, he said, no, just show me where the market is. So this "show me where the market is" became a synonymous with Islam as a religion of trade, but of course a trade support with imperial force. So this is how I could describe Islam in all honesty.
And by the way, you're not just somebody that's saying that I don't know how old you were when you could do this. You memorized every word in the Quran, right?
I was 12 by the time I finished the process. I started at the age of 9. 33 months later, basically, I finished memorizing the Quran.
Is that pretty common for kids at that age to memorize the Quran? I don't think that's common, right?
I think 1 out of 20, at least in my town, basically it was almost 1 out of 20 who would do it.
That's still a big number. I mean, in America, I don't know if 1 out of 1,000 kids memorize every word in the U.S. Bible. I don't know how many people do.
Yeah, but I think the Quran is a little bit smaller than the Bible if we put together the Old and the New Testament. The Quran has about 6,236 verses, roughly about 143,000 words. So basically, it is not that easy to, not that difficult to memorize, but not that easy either. Basically, yeah.
Still a challenging thing to
do.
But let me go. So let's go back to Osama bin Laden. So you hear him speak. The guy next to you goes and drives the van into the embassy in Nairobi. Lives, 150 people are permanently blind. We see this all over the news. I think it was 98. I don't know the exact year when that happened, late 90s. And at this point, you're hearing this. What's next move for you? Because you stayed there only for, 2 years? December of 98, right? December 98 is when you left. So what was the experience like when you were in there? Did you ever get close to him to kind of see how he thinks, Osama? And then what caused you to want to leave?
I remember when I gave my allegiance to him and joining Al-Qaeda, I remember he looked at me and he said that he wants me to go and to become part of Al-Qaeda's explosives, chemical and biological weapon program. Why? Because he said, you don't look like the materials of commandos. You're not a commando material. I'm not going to be someone who would be carrying heavy weapons and storming.
What's that to him? Who is the right material of a commander to him?
Well, 5'9", and above. I'm 5'7". Also, basically, someone who's not actually wearing glasses all the time. Someone basically with a better eyesight. But nonetheless, basically, he said, I see that you have an aptitude for math and science, and you will be the perfect fit for that. Like, I mean, so I ended up being sent by him to a remote camp in Afghanistan, which was run by an Egyptian former officer of the bomb squad in the Egyptian army. And he was already a veteran of the Afghan jihad. He's been there since 1986. He was the master bomb maker in all of Afghanistan, and he was a master in his art. So the idea is to go into that remote camp in the mountains and study with him. So that was, for me, an eye-opening experience. I mean, basically, first of all, only very few people, make it into that camp. And the reason is because when you go there, there are only 4 students each course. So the course could run for 7 months, but there are only 4 people who would be studying. That's it. So the camp is really small. And the reason for the small number is to limit the possibility of a mistake. The bigger the number of students, the easier it is to have a mistake. And the problem is with making bombs, as anyone will know, that your first mistake is your last mistake. That's it. No more mistakes to be made.
You don't get second chances.
Exactly. So, so there I've learned, the basics of explosive makings, and then into, the bomb making, and then into chemical weapons, poisons, and then into biological weapons. It took about 7-8 months, but it was extremely eye-opening, for me. And I remember the 3 people who were studying with me. I had a Moroccan, a Tunisian, and a Saudi. The Saudi was later years an assistant of Zarqawi and was captured by the Americans. His name was Hassan Gul. The Moroccan was, later captured in Morocco in 2003, attempting to blow up synagogues there in Morocco. And then the Tunisian, who was a pure psychopath. This Tunisian guy ended up.
What was his name? What was the Tunisian's name?
His name was Abu Nassim. That's the alias, but his real name was Mu'izz Fazdani. He ended up actually masterminding the terrorist attacks on behalf of ISIS in Tunisia in recent years. The attack in the Bardo Museum, and later in the Sousa beach, which killed 31 British tourists. So he was the mastermind of these attacks. Now, I would say that out of all the people who were with me in that camp, he was the closest to me. I don't know, was I like attracting a psychopath or? And he was the best cook. He was, he lived in Italy, so his pasta cooking skills were legendary. So we used to have pasta, yes, in Afghanistan, in the middle of the mountains. We used to have pasta, for dinners there, and while we are busy learning, how to make bombs and explosives. Now, then, of course, came August of 1998. That was a seminal event in my life, because that is when that young man who was my friend from the camp, who came with me to see Osama bin Laden and to listen to him 2 years earlier, he, of course, went on to blow up the American embassy in Nairobi, and another guy then blew up the American embassy in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and simultaneously. Of course, when the news came to the camps, I mean, people were saying, rejoice, the largest CIA station in East Africa were bombed to the ground. And I was thinking, okay, CIA station, that's amazing, that's good. But then, of course, like many other young Al-Qaeda members, I have a radio. So I have a radio, and I was listening, to one of the radio stations from the Arab world, like, basically we pick up in the mountains. It was Kuwait radio. And also we used to pick up the BBC Arabic. So they said that it was the American embassies in Nairobi in Kenya and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So I thought, that's, okay, 1 minute here. Why are we bombing embassies? That's one. And then when the news of the identities of those who were killed started to come, first, we were told that 12 Americans were killed, in addition to about 220 innocent Kenyans, Somalis, and other Africans who were there, basically to apply for visas, to visit their friends and family, or to study, or to do business in the US. So basically, and many others who were there at the wrong place at the wrong time. I just did not feel right, because Al-Qaeda is preparing me to be the future bomb maker. I will be one of those who will be building one of these giant devices that will go into a van that will do exactly this. It dawned on me more than any of the others in the camps, because they are just foot soldiers. However, I'm the bomb maker of the future. I'm the one who is going to build this and kill these people, and I will be meeting God on the day of judgment with their blood on my hand, basically, and they will be asking him, ask this, dude here, why did he kill us? So why did he build a device that actually ended our lives and ended the, our dreams? So for me, like, I mean, that epiphany, that moment was so, strong and powerful enough to question my whole existence within that framework, within Al-Qaeda. And I remember I went to the de facto mufti of Al-Qaeda at that time, the religious, advisor. He's Egyptian. His name is Abu Abdullah al-Muhajir, and he himself was involved in the attack on another embassy 3 years earlier, the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad, when it was razed to the ground by a suicide bomber. He had a hand in that operation too. So I went to ask him. I said, look, I'm not doubting. I just want my heart to be at peace here. Remember, Sheikh Abu Abdullah, his name is Abu Abdullah al-Muhajir. I said, one day I will be building a device like this. So could you please help me understand how I can justify it? So he said, look, the embassy was actually a front for the CIA. Okay, that I got. That's fine. What else? What about the people basically who were there? He said, look, we have a fatwa in our Islamic theology that when the enemy is hiding within civilian populated areas, we have the right to attack, and then those civilians who died, the result of our action, then God will make it up to them. In other words, the famous saying of kill them and God will sort them out. I said, okay, fine. Where do you find this fatwa? He told me where to find it, which is in the comprehensive works of Ibn Taymiyyah, which is a scholar living 700 years ago. And I thought, goodness, that's 37 volumes. God help me, like, where do I find it? But anyway, I asked him, I said, isn't it, awful that 220 innocent people, basically, died so to get at 12 Americans? So he said to me, come on, they were just a bunch of Africans, who cares? I looked at him and I said, should you tell that to the Somalis in our camp here? They wouldn't take it nicely. He said, oh, no. And on second thought, just don't tell them. Yeah, casual racism was, what casual actually? It was outrageous racism also exists within Al-Qaeda. Can you believe it? Even within Al-Qaeda, we were racist against each other. The Saudis against the Egyptians, the Algerians against the Egyptians and the Saudis, and the Tunisians hated every single one of them. And the Yemenis were always described as ignorant mountain monkeys. Yes, it was always like this. The, Islamic solidarity, seriously. Anyway, so I went.
How many other guys at that time are feeling the same way you're feeling? Were there other people coming up to you? Or were you the only person that was second guessing everything?
I was the only one, from what I could tell. I was the only one. I went to the library of Al-Qaeda in Kabul. They have a massive library there for their Islamic Sharia courses, and so I searched for that fatwa in that book. I found it, and no resemblance whatsoever. It was talking about a very completely different, era. It talks about the Mongol invasion of the Khwarizmid Persian Empire, and how the Mongols had a practice where when they sack a city in the Muslim world at that time, they will take some civilians from that city. They will make them push the siege towers, the Mongol siege towers, towards the walls of the next Muslim city they intend to sack. And of course, the Muslim defenders have a dilemma here. Do we shoot arrows and spears at those poor civilians who are being coerced into pushing the siege towers towards our walls, or not? So they sent urgent requests for fatwas, and the fatwas came back. Look, they are already dead, whether you kill them by your own hands or by the Mongol hands once they are done with them. So defend yourselves, kill them to prevent the siege towers from coming into your walls. Now, can you see here any resemblance between that fatwa and how they actually applied it in the case of the American embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam? I mean, I'm sorry, but I didn't see the American embassy in Nairobi pushing siege towers towards Mecca or Medina.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, that's kind of how, when certain pastors interpret the Bible scripture in their own way to manipulate some audiences, and these are when they go away from the Bible and you want to create their own church. And you see this a lot of time with some people doing that to be able to win people over. But going back to it, so that event takes place. You said that's August '98. I just, you still are there for 4 more months. During those 4 more months that you're there, are you being recruited by MI6? Are you gathering intel? Are you like, I don't know how to leave this place. I'm afraid to leave. What if they kill me? Maybe I still want to stick around. What are you thinking for those 4 months before you left?
Actually, I was waiting for my departure date. So by September, roughly about 4 weeks after the incident, I made my mind after I read the fatwa, after, of course, the cruise missile attack against our camps, by President Clinton. I decided that I don't want to be part of this anymore. One day they will tell me to build a device like this. It's inevitable. I don't want to be the author of death of many innocent people who I will never meet. I will never know who they are. And I was always wondering in the back of my mind, that when my death date comes, I will be facing them in the afterlife. No, thank you. I don't want to be in that position. So I decided to leave. The problem is I already have a departure date for a medical checkup in Qatar. It was an important medical checkup because a year earlier, I had been struck by both malaria and typhoid at the same time. And that caused some damage to the liver. So the hospital in Qatar that treated me, because there wasn't enough, advanced medical facilities in Afghanistan or Pakistan at the time to treat me, they told me you have to come back in a year time exactly to make sure that there is no damage or no lasting damage. So I decided that I have to use that. But the problem is that date is December 8th. And between September, and December, there are few months, but I have to stay there. I have no other choice, to wait for that departure date, which is allocated for me. And so therefore I waited, but I wasn't waiting, doing nothing. I ended up actually, subconsciously, gathering a lot of information, copying some of the floppy disks. Floppy disks. Now, for the millennials who are listening, floppy disks are ancient tools where we can store data and information. And they were 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches, I think. And I don't know how much we can store on them. 2 or 3 megabytes, I can't remember. Anyway,
nothing. Yeah, nothing.
So I gathered few floppy disks which contain the entire Al-Qaeda program on explosives, bomb making, chemical weapons, biological weapons, poisons. I gathered it all basically there, and I also basically applied myself to study on the map all the locations of the camps, of the places, of the houses of the leadership.
Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that at that time? Are you thinking vengeance? Are you thinking I'm going to stop these guys? Are you thinking I'm going to go to somebody with this information? Why are you gathering that intel?
I think it was for me insurance policy.
I got you.
Yeah, because I wasn't leaving Afghanistan to become a spy. Let me put it this way: I wasn't leaving to become a spy. I was leaving to go back to university and to study history and then to become a history teacher. That was my dream, which was a naive dream. Now, much to the delight and the relief of my would-be students, it never happened. So, I left to Qatar. I arrived there, only to be actually detained by the Qatari intelligence. They were waiting for me, funny enough. And and they were aware of my arrival thanks to a tip by the French intelligence. How did they know? I have no idea. So once I was there, I was of course, like basically interrogated. In the first 45 minutes, basically they were trying to be intimidating. The Qatari intelligence officials, they were trying to be really intimidating and trying to scare me and whatever. And what they found from my side was a very cooperative and friendly individual. So that's when they switched on the lights, because of course it was dark at my side, and they switched on the lights, and I can see their faces now. And they were telling me, what's going on here? Why are you being so, nice and friendly? And so I said, well, maybe you caught me at the right time. Basically, actually, I came here because I was leaving, and I explained to them the whole thing as I explained it to you now. So they said, okay, 1 minute. So they left the room, all 5, 6 of them. And then, I think they were discussing something. Minutes later, they came back, and they all came back to shake my hand and to hug me so tight and to say, well done. Well done. We believe you. So now we have a lot of questions for you. Would you be willing to answer? And they are coming from a Western intelligence service. Of course, later I was told it was the French. Regarding a specific individual, a specific plot, a specific, incident. So I was happy to supply them with all the information they needed. It was groundbreaking as far as they understand. And they said to me, by the end of the 9 days, I was their guest. Of course, the treatment was amazing. Basically, I ended up basically being brought meals from the nearby 5-star hotel of the Sheraton, to make it, to make my stay comfortable. But then they told me that we know that you want to go to a normal life, but we can't offer you this in Qatar. Qatar at that time, it was 1998, it was in Doha, it was a city of 250,000 people. Wow. You will be meeting many of your friends on daily basis. You will just run into them in the mosques and the supermarkets and wherever you go. I mean, and so it's not safe for you here. We suggest that you are better protected if you are to go under the protection of a larger country, a more powerful agency that will, make use of you, but at the same time protect you. I said, okay, and who do you have in mind? They said, well, of course, the French are extending their, warm welcome because they already been hearing you via video link, for the past 9 days. And also there are the British and the Americans. So I said, okay, and how long do I have to make up my mind? Basically, like in a day or two? No, 30 minutes. So 30 minutes to make up my mind. And so I remember I, sat down, thought to myself, basically, if the dear Lord got me out of Afghanistan into here, into the lap of the intelligence services, and I already trusted in his judgment. If this is his judgment, so be it. I decided not the French. I don't want to learn another language, and I'm not exactly very fond of them to begin with. Then, the Americans, I just survived their cruise missile attack just a few months ago. I can't just, be lovey-dovey with someone who just, basically pressed the button to kill me just a few months ago. However, the British, there is an affinity. My grandfather fought for the British in Iraq in 1915. And in later life, I realized basically that my father worked for the UK Foreign Office, possibly intelligence services in the 1960s and 70s. So that was a revelation that I didn't expect. And then, of course, I decided, well, there is affinity with the British already. I've been to London before on a mission for Al-Qaeda. There is some familiarity there, so I chose, basically to go and work with the British intelligence services. So that night, boarded the plane, British Airways flight, and I flew to London.
Once you got there, how soon did they find out that you're with MI6? If not while you're there for years, and if they did find out, did anybody reach out to you? Were you ever worried? Was your life ever threatened? Were you living a peaceful life? What happened next?
Well, of course, MI6 was amazing at concocting a cover story for my arrival. The Qatari hospital in Qatar decided that my situation is life-threatening, that they need to send me to a hospital in the UK. So they flew me there, under the pretense. And once I'm there, a hospital room was ready for me, and I invited some of my friends from Al-Qaeda who were based in London to come and see me, so they can see for real, basically, that I was, basically hospitalized and paid for by the Qatari embassy. That all, basically laid the fears. And then it was by the invitation of members of Al-Qaeda in London that I stayed in London, basically for the foreseeable future, in order to help them with lots of things, including recruitment, fundraising, and other activities. So suddenly, it's like the effort by MI6 paid off. But the idea was that I'm supposed to be in London for 2 months for debriefings. So the debriefing of MI6 about everything that I knew, including the maps and the floppy disks, basically, that I brought with me, the data on Al-Qaeda's activities and bomb making and explosive and chemical weapons and everything else. That debriefing lasted 7 months. I didn't know I had so much knowledge in my head, but it turns out to be the case. Like, I knew so much. So the idea is, I was told, I remember I arrived, it was I think 16th or 17th of December. When I arrived in London, it was just Christmas, about to to come the week after. The MI5 and MI6 counterterrorism officers who greeted me said, Christmas, came very early this year. We didn't know that, Santa come dressed in a beard like yours. So, that was a wonderful thing to hear. Of course, when I arrived there, the British intelligence services, both MI5 and MI6, were just starting to recruit more and more from their internal offices and other departments into the counterterrorism. Until Nairobi and Tanzania, attacks, the MI6 was focusing on the former Soviet Union republics, the proliferation of nuclear materials, the gun running out of the Ukraine and other places, counter-espionage, all of that thing. MI5 was focusing on the IRA, the Irish terrorism and organized crime and the mafia coming out of Russia. So there was, that was their focus. So basically, suddenly, the offices of Islamic counterterrorism within MI5 and MI6 need to swell their ranks. And I came at the same time, the same time frame. So for me, they were bringing more and more of their analysts to every meeting in order to learn, to study, to understand, and so to, so basically it was the timing of my arrival, I think, basically, that, at later years, I was told that I did make a difference. They always used to tell me that the timing of your arrival made a lot of difference. It was just the right time when we are about, to recruit more and more people from within the ranks. They needed a crash course immediately, basically, on what's happening. You were the right, I won't say guinea pig, but you were the right person to come at the right time in order to explain it all. And at the time, I was only 20.
How long did you stay with MI6?
Until I was 28, 8 years.
8 years you were with them. And so now you're still in UK today?
Yes. No
death threats?
I mean, they tried twice. I already had the fatwa on my head in 2008. There were, 2 attempts on my life, once in 2009 in London, and another, which was a serious one, actually. It was in 2016 in Bahrain. That was supposed to coincide with the 15th anniversary of 9/11. So yeah, I mean, basically, like, it's not plain sailing, but at the same time, I'm not exactly like, afraid. At the end of the day, if I was willing to sacrifice my life for the wrong, cause, it would be extremely hypocritical of me, if I'm to be a coward, working for the right cause.
What a mindset to have. What a mindset to have, to know that you go through that, where it becomes normal to be a martyr, to give your life to something. But at that time, you don't believe in it, but still it influences you so much that one day you will accept the fact that you're willing to give your life to something of positive and good. Makes it a little bit more, like it almost desensitizes you to it. Like, it's not a big deal. If I'm giving it up for the right reasons, I'll do it. I don't know if a lot of people are going to go through that desensitization, if that's even a word to go through it. So let me change the direction of the conversation here. We'll wrap up. This has been great. Is from the outside looking in, you're in UK. You know, one question is just for me personally. You know, you mentioned something about Khomeini, and he was doing the tapes when he was in France, and he was sending it in and putting the taxis, and everybody would listen to it, and he caused a revolution. The Shah fell, et cetera, et cetera. Are you aware of who were the political prisoners that he had, the 3,000 political prisoners that he had when Jimmy Carter was forcing him, because he was campaigning on human rights, and he wanted the Shah to let go of the political prisoners that he had in Iran. Some of them were Tudeh, which I don't know if you're familiar with. Tudeh is the communists at that time. But were any of the people that he had there individuals that later on ended up causing 9/11, that the political prisoners in Iran, or you're not aware of it?
Between you and me, I'm not aware of it.
Okay,
the only person I'm aware, basically, that more or less had provided help and logistics, like for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and enabling some of the drug trade to go through Sistan and Baluchistan, from the Afghan border, was the leader of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani,
which they later took out, Qasem Soleimani. Indeed. Under Trump. So from the outside looking into U.S., what do you see happening in U.S.? I mean, you've been around the block for a while. Does U.S. in where you are, UK, when you're watching BBC, I know you watch CNN as well, because you mentioned CNN. What is your interpretation of where America is at right now?
Well, what worries me, and you remember I talked about the civil wars in Yugoslavia.
Clearly, that's why I'm asking the question. I remember when you said that, yeah.
I always worry when people of different political and religious and ideological persuasions start to view the other side as the enemy so much. There is a word, or a phrase attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which says that love your friends moderately, for they may become your enemies one day, and detest your enemies moderately, for they may become your friends one day. Moderation is the key to the longevity of nations. And, no matter how much.
Who said this?
That's the Prophet Muhammad. Moderation is, the key to the longevity of nations. We can't have a situation where the left hate the right so much they will call them Nazis, and the right hate the left so much that they will see them as subversive communist, revolutionaries. I mean, there has to be that middle ground somewhere where we all can meet and agree on something, while at the same time, when we moderate our positions on the left and on the right, then we can guarantee the longevity and the coexistence between all of these factions for the benefit of the greater good. What is the greater good, in my opinion? The nation state. I always, get asked the question, who are you loyal to? Islam, the UK, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain? I say, no, I am loyal to the nation state. To the nation state, wherever that nation state may be, as long as they adhere to the basic principles of the nation state, with the institutions of the nation state, judicial, and otherwise, in order to maintain, prosperity, stability, security, law and order, for everyone. The civil war that we have in Islam right now is actually between factions who want to destroy the modern nation state and the modern nation state. We have the Sunni political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. They want to bring down the nation state. We have the militant Sunni Islam, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, whatever. They want to bring down the nation state. We have the political and militant Shia Islam, Wilayat al-Faqih system in Tehran. They want to bring down the nation state, all for the sake of a borderless, superstructure of Islamic empire they want to revive based on fictional ideas of a Mahdi, a Messiah, and whatever, basically, which doesn't exist. It's a fabrication from Islamic history. The reality is there is no escaping the fact that the only guarantor of safety, security, stability, law and order is the nation state. And you can't have a nation state if you always have people who, on the right, always detest the government and its institutions and its, basically principle, duty in protecting its citizens, or on the left, who basically say no borders, no nations, that's it, just, basically defund the police, no more, basically nation state institutions. We have this problem. We need to bring both fringes down a notch or two in order basically to ensure the survival of the nation state, because many of those who oppose the nation state, either on the right or the left, did not see what I saw when I spent 6 years of my life in 4 different war zones, where I saw what the collapse of the nation state means. No ATM outside to get your cash, no safety, no security, no fire brigade, no police force, only warlords who would rape your women and children, only people who would steal your food, and you don't think about survival until the next 5 years when you graduate. No, you think about survival for the next 5 days, or sometimes even 5 hours or 5 minutes. That is why young millennials, in the States need to take a breath and read some history books about what a collapse of the nation state really means.
What a powerful last 45 seconds, what you just said. I wish we had more time together. I got to tell you, I've enjoyed this. I was told about this interview 2 hours before you and I sat down together. You know the story already. I told you off the record what took place, but yeah. I am so glad we did this interview today. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I hope the right people that watch this, it'll also get them to question certain mindsets they have and certain ways that we can all improve to become a little bit more civil than divided as we are right now in the US. Anyways, having said that, we're going to put the links below to both your books. Once again, thank you so much for making the time to be a guest on Valuetainment.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Al-Qaeda to MI6, what a story. Did you notice every time I'd ask questions, he can go deeper and deeper and deeper in some of the answers he made? Curious to know your takeaway. Comment below. If you enjoyed it, press the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I got 2 other interviews for you to consider. One of them is with Hammoudi Jassim, who was part of the Iraqi army. I think he was the youngest sergeant major that they had, and then he became a spy. He turned on them. If you've not seen that, click over here. And the other one is a story of Latif Yahya, who was Saddam Hussein's son's double, and he had a chance to be around him, and the stories he tells is mind-boggling. If you want to be entertained, click over here. With that being said, have a good one, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.